So a few weeks ago, there's a lady at church that walked up to me and she says, Here is a book that I'd like for you to look at. And I didn't know what it was about. And over the years, I've had many people hand me books that they felt were important to read. And some of them were, and some of them weren't. And so I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know this lady all that well, but she had heard me preach a couple times. And she says, I'd like to know your opinion of this. And the name of the book is called Undoing Conquest, Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity. And I didn't know what it was. I set it aside for a little bit, and then I picked it up and I started reading. And it's a book about the book of Joshua. And it's talking about the long, complex process where the Israelite tribes came to settle in the land. And as I was reading, I was going, in all the years I went to school, uh, there has not been such a compelling small book to get us to think a little bit more about how the people of Israel entered into the promised land, how they settled there, what some of their traditions were, and what implications that was for the future of Christianity. And so this particular book, I thought, oh, this might be good to do. It's not very big at all. We'll take maybe a week or two and let's look and see what it has to say. But it will force us to think, and by that I mean there are things in this book that might challenge your traditional understanding of the book of Joshua. So in this book, it's written by a lady by the name of Kate Common. And her argument is basically that the conquest story in the book of Joshua is more shaped by the Christian assumptions of how ancient people recorded history or non-history, but put it in the context of a historical narrative. And she goes on in the book and she talks about how we understand the book of Joshua greatly influences how we think about certain things and how it has shaped really uh, the Christian imagination that sometimes uses passages like Joshua to justify colonialism, violence, land seizure, genocide, that type of thing. So, what I'm saying is the book of Joshua has long been used because of its battle texts and because of its conquest narrative to be used, and I'll give you some examples of these in a little bit, to justify decisions within other people's histories. So this book is really combining several things. Archaeology. Is this really how the land was conquered? Was it really done by a quick and complete removal of the Canaanites, or was it something slower? Was it a process? And if it is, why is the book of Joshua showing us almost as if Joshua and his army just marched right in and took Jericho and Ai and forced the Canaanites out of the land, that type of thing? So she's asking the question, is there another way to look at these conquest narratives? And what evidence is there that maybe the story does not reflect actual course of events, but rather the details are being shaped for a particular reason, and through archaeological excavations and through sociological analysis, um, maybe there is a different way of understanding what the book of Joshua is really doing. So tonight, I want to talk a little bit about the book of Joshua. Then next week, I want to talk a little bit about what Joshua is trying to do. He's trying to reinforce, so I'll give you a thumbnail, the book of Deuteronomy more than anything else. Now, that's for next time. So tonight, what I want to do is ask the question, are these conquest narratives, are they being used for other political purposes rather than just historical accounting of the facts, dates and places, that type of thing? So you might find this interesting. Kate Common is an assistant professor of public and practical theology at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio and a Louisville Institute scholar. She earned her PhD in theological studies, most recently in year 2020 from Boston University. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what she has to say by looking at some of the themes that this book contains. And I'm not going in this order, but you can just kind of keep this in the back of your mind. Is there a tension between what has been found by archaeology and a wooden biblical literalism, reading the text as literal history? Secondly, um, how did the formation of the nation of Israel develop? And what importance is there to the highlands settlements in the area of Canaan? Thirdly, why were these conquest stories written in the first place? So it's not just the book of Judges, Joshua, it's also the book of Judges as well, where we find a repetition going on of them reconquering land that they lost. And of course, the writer of Judges says basically everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. We'll come back to that. Next is how does that play into our own understanding? How does it shape our own history, especially in Western colonialism? How the nation of the United States took land and moved westward? What some of the imagery was used to justify pushing out Native Americans, indigenous people, that type of thing. And then finally, the power of collective stories to shape our ethics and our identity. So these are not just individual stories, they are stories that are shaping us in various ways. So I want you to think for a moment. What stories did you hear? Perhaps you were quite young about God, and how did it shape your understanding of God? So I give you some possibilities there. When I say God, you think of blank. Well, for some people, they think of God as a protector, some as a judge, some as a warrior, some as a loving parent, some seeing God as a distant creator, and some as a rescuer. And the author is trying to tell us in this small book that the stories that we tell ourselves about God shape who we become as people and what we expect in the world around us. So the stories kind of hold us together, if you will. They shape our collective and social imagination. And the story of the Hebrew people is foundational, not only for Western thought, but in many faith traditions. That seems to be a starting place. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, so forth, the promise to Moses, the conquest of the land, the building of the temple, the exile, coming back from exile, all those type of things. Then we have to think a little bit about the problem. Do these stories still serve a purpose for us today? What happens if they're shaping us the wrong way? What if it is causing us to justify compromised ethics and doing to other people what God would never think of doing to people, as illustrated in the person of Jesus? Because these stories affect our identity, part of our work as Bible readers, as Christians, as those who are theologians, is how do we wrestle with violent historical accounts that contribute not only to the day they live, but even possibly to our own social imagination as well. So, with that in mind, I want to begin before we talk about Joshua. I want to talk about conquest theology. There's a lot of conquest stories in the book of Joshua. There's some in the book of Judges as well. There's plenty in the storyline of Saul and David and Solomon. And they became kind of a framework of understanding for Jewish identity. This is who we are. God is on our side. And because he's on our side, he will bring victory to our military battles. How does this then become a framework for other nations and churches and even empires that we are observing on the stage today? How is this informing modern day Israel? Are they still operating on a conquest theology? How is it shaping us as the United States? How is it shaping other groups of people around the globe? Well, conquest theology includes usually these four things. Number one, it chooses one group of people as holy or chosen over other groups of people. And so the nation of Israel considers herself the chosen people. The church considers itself to be the chosen people. And the more Calvinistic you are, the more pronounced that becomes. We are a part of the elect. Secondly, land possession as a divine right. God promised us this land. Therefore, we have the right to take it. Thirdly, violence is not only justified, but it is even seen as holy. This is holy war. And what we're doing is not only commanded by God, but it honors God as well. And finally, number four, outsiders that are always viewed as threats. They are enemies that must be eliminated. Now, the concern is not merely that violent stories exist in Scripture. The concern is, how are these stories used? And are we misusing these texts? So when you hear of people that will want to justify war, they usually will dip their toe back into the Old Testament rather than the teachings of Jesus. So now we come to Joshua 1 through 11. And in these 11 chapters, um, some theologians classify them as texts of terror because commandments are given to wipe out all living things, men, women, children, animals. And then the text raises these questions that are difficult. Is this violence holy? And then how are we to read ancient war literature in our own day and age? How is it to inform us? And what should we be cautious of? And what do we do with texts of terror when it conflicts with Jesus' teaching? Turning the other cheek, loving your enemy, those type of things. So questioning our interpretation of maybe how we've understood certain parts of the Bible is not the same thing as rejecting faith. Rather, we're trying to negotiate the tension between the past and the present. And how is it that we take these stories and meet the current cultural moments that we are living in? And if we don't do that, do we use violence as a way of justifying political goals? Would it be seen in some of the imagery that is used? So when we think back to January 6th and the riot that took place against the nation's capital, a lot of this imagery, the blowing of the shofar and things like that, was used as a way of almost justifying we are doing this for the betterment of our country and God is on our side. So what we want to do for the next few moments is understand that these historical connections between ancient conquest narratives and our own history has been used and has contributed to, you can see the list here, certain colonialization used by European nations, in the United States, there was this idea of manifest destiny, that this is what we are called to do, to push westward and eliminate anyone that's in the way. The doctrine of discovery, God allowed us to find this land. Um, Even apartheid theology comes into play here, eliminating and subduing people who are not like us. And most recently, within the last 10 years, it plays real strong into Christian nationalism. And so the concept of being chosen people um, is something that has more than an afterlife expectation. It can be traced to, we are the people God loves, those are the people God hates. And the distinctive American reinterpretation of the promised land, especially. So, this land is the promised land, and the vision is such that we are to take it, even as Israel did the land of Canaan. It is God's gift to us, and we will use military conquest and colonization of native people that are here to occupy our own promised land. So the idea of a promised land has something to do with sacred territory. Now, in Joshua, Israel is portrayed as receiving the land from God and taking possession of it through warfare. So God gives the people the land that was based upon the Abrahamic covenant, parts of the Mosaic covenant, and certainly it's found in Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law. The existing inhabitants then become obstacles to this divine destiny that God has chosen for this group of people. And expansion is framed as obedience to God. We are being disobedient if we don't expand and conquer this territory. And this type of pattern often occurs repetitively over the course of history. So European settlers in North America compared themselves to Israel entering the land of Canaan. This is especially true among the English Puritans, who described Native Americans, indigenous people, as Canaanites. Settlers in the colonial movement often used promised land imagery and language to speak of their desire to obtain all of the land. So this brings up this idea of holy war. Is this a divine authorization? Now, when you look in the book of Joshua, that's the way it's framed. The Hebrew people used a concept of harem, which means the ban of certain types of people or total destruction of certain kinds of people. Uh, this will contribute to later ideas as well, where war is seen as righteous, where enemies are demonized, where violence is purified as part of divine purpose. And of course, this really is dominant during the Crusades, where the Crusaders often drew on Old Testament conquest imagery, reclaiming sacred land, fighting God's enemies, cleansing the territory so that a divine mission could be achieved. But that didn't end there. It did have its place in our own history. The United States used conquest language from Joshua, especially manifest destiny. America's the new Israel, the frontier is Canaan, indigenous people are the Canaanites. So sometimes politicians, preachers, and settlers quoted the book of Joshua during this era to establish a right for territorial expansion, forced removal of the people, and cultural domination. Ultimately, this is what drives the Trail of Tears that wiped out a good portion of indigenous people upon our continent. So, what we have is, in some way here, and this is how it plays into our own day and age, a fusion of religion and empire. It seems Joshua became useful for that and gave moral legitimacy to it. Empires often need stories that will sanctify that, define insiders and outsiders, and portray domination as a destiny.
And if you read Joshua closely, that's what's happening in the victory narratives in chapters 1 through 11. There's also the idea of divine election. And there is a theological nationalism that's taking place as well, because what they are trying to do in the early parts of Joshua is erase the indigenous people that were already there in the highlands of Canaan. So, one of the dangerous uses of Joshua could be the moral framing of this as something that God definitely wants. And yeah, what you're going to find when you couple it with not only Judges, where Judges gives us a completely different picture of how the land was settled. It's back and forth, it's up and down. There's defeat, a little bit of victory, then defeat again. All these, not in Joshua. Everything seems to be idealized, as if they just marched right in, and there were no there were no people that lost their lives. It's almost the way it's portrayed that they just marched right in. God was protecting with an iron dome over them, and they were able to defeat the enemies. So, in colonial settings, though, these indigenous people are given that picture of being an obstacle to what God wants upon this land. And it was a way of normalizing violence and mistreatment of a lot of Native Americans. Now, the book talks a little bit about archaeology. That when archaeology factors into the account of Joshua, that it gives a different picture. So, archaeology is not just academic information. Here's what we found in our recent dig. It's telling us something about scripture. It's telling us something about the way history was portrayed. And it's telling us a little bit about how people established their national identity. This is who they thought themselves to be. So most of us probably grew up thinking Joshua's conquest of Canaan was literal history that had happened exactly the way it's recorded in the book. But archaeological evidence is challenging that narrative. And as faith communities, we are challenged as a result. What do we do with this new knowledge? And how does it shape our current theology on the topic? Theology is never static. Theology is orthodox until it comes to a point where there are facts that cause us to question what we once believed and have to adjust accordingly. So, what archaeologists looked at uh, very closely is what's called the Highland settlements. The Highland being the promised land. I'm going to show you a picture on a map here in a second. And it is suggesting that Israel did not conquer the land quickly, that it rather gradually emerged from Canaanite society rather than a complete violent military invasion. So, when researchers started studying the Iron Age, they began seeing that origins of people groups emerging by what they found and what they dated and what they surmised to be the reason that these communities looked the way they did. So, archaeology is suggesting that there was a social process to the Hebrew people, and they entered the land not just because of the story of the Exodus, but they also entered the land from what they could surmise to be extreme social and climate conditions. That they were trying to find new land where they could farm and grow food. And what archaeology has been saying is these people faced at times some severe drought. We know that to be true even in the Old Testament text, right? That drought was a very real thing, especially in the Genesis where they have to go down to Egypt to get grain and all that type of thing. And Egypt controlled these highland settlements for a long time, and that these new communities lived in conjunction with the power of Egypt until Egypt lost control of the territory. The Egyptian Empire is in close proximity to the highland settlements. They controlled the land, and the people went into these areas as a way of escaping some of the oppression that was found close to the Empire of Egypt. And they began hiding out and establishing community. So here's what I want you to think about. Think Afghanistan. Think of how the people found themselves in places where they could not be invaded, they could not be killed, those type of things. They knew the territory, and they did this. And archaeologists say that this probably happened over a course of about 150 years. And these formed as small agricultural settlements. There's no evidence of initial military destruction. And there's some continuity with the Canaanite culture that was close to Egypt, but they're trying to escape because of some of the hardship that was placed upon them by the Egyptian Empire. So that rings true, doesn't it, with Israel? They were enslaved for 400 years. The Exodus text tells us they kept crying out to God to be delivered. Finally, they emerge out of Egypt. They head toward a promised land, and that's where Joshua picks up after the book of Deuteronomy. But that's next week. Joshua, it seems, is trying to establish uh, the commands and expectations of the book of Deuteronomy. But we'll put that on hold until next week. So, archaeologists are saying there's limited signs of social hierarchy, that these are people that have their own innovations socially, they have their own language. There's a lot of ancient Near Eastern languages that establish out of this, and some of that um, dovetails a little bit with biblical texts. For example, in the book of Daniel, there's two languages that are in the book of Daniel. We find that Ugaritic was a big language that gives insight into Old Testament research as well. And then their own cultic practices as well. What is it that they developed as a part of their identity? So, what are the highland settlements? So, you'll recognize some of these here. So, initially, here, the highland settlements consisted mostly of indigenous Canaanites who withdrew from what archaeologists call urban city states, and they gradually leave that, and they establish new settlements and develop kind of a new ethnic identity. You'll see here some of the places that you find in the book of Joshua. You see Jericho there in the green. You might have heard of Joppa. You might have heard of Megiddo or Tyre or Damascus. This is all in that green area there that is now known as Israel, but it was all Canaanite territory back in the day. A little bit later, and this is a little bit smaller, what you find is that the highland settlements actually become recognizable to biblical language. You have Upper Galilee, you have the Samaria highlands, and then you have the Judean hills, and you have then the Negev highlands to the south. And what we find is these people are make their way into these areas. They settle down. Many archaeologists believes that that might consist of 20 homes. It's not real big, but 20 homes that house 5, 6 people. So maybe 100 people or so are part of these little communities and so forth. And so what we find here is that as these people flee, there was a name that was given to them. And in Hebrew, or rather in archaeological discovery, the word is Habiru, Haberu. And they think that that has some influence upon what became the word Hebrew, Haberu. Well, what did that mean? It was talking about people who were uh, individuals that lived on the margins of society, but it also included people that could be soldiers or slaves or outlaws that are fleeing for whatever reason. And they find these little communities and they settle down in these little communities. And from that, then, comes the development of a slow transformation among these existing Canaanite populations. And here it is believed the um, that the nation of Israel, rather than blitzkrieg conquest, is a picture of gradual emergence. And they see this in some of the things that they have discovered. For example, excavations in Jericho and Ai don't show any layers of destruction that would happen in a military conquest. So all of these scholars are trying to understand how all of this plays in to what we read in the Old Testament, first in the book of Joshua and then in the book of Judges. And Israel's identity may have been formed through social reorganization, resistance, obviously, to oppressive systems, but the communal development. Because one of the things you'll read about in the book of Judges, and I'm going to show you this in a moment, is that several times in the book of Judges it says they did not drive out the Canaanites. They did not drive out the Canaanites. They did not drive out the Canaanites. Now, conservative theology will say, well, they were being disobedient to God and they didn't drive out the Canaanites. But this perspective is no, they began to merge into these territories. They began to make a life. They began to do their work. They began even to intermarry with some of the people that already lived there. So before we look at Joshua and Judges and a few scriptures, I want to ask the question, why would they tell a conquest story? If the conquest isn't exactly as it says in the book of Joshua, why does the Bible tell it that way? So the conquest narratives might have emerged much later. In other words, Joshua might not have been written as early as what conservative scholars think it is written, that it is written much later as a way of trying to regain national identity because they had gone into exile. So what many scholars believe is when people pick up the Bible and they read Genesis and they get all the way through Joshua and Judges, they think all of this is happening sequentially and chronologically. But what research is showing us is many of these stories came to its final form in the exile or after the exile when they're trying to reestablish their identity. So if that is the case, these biblical writers are intentionally trying to reshape identity, trying to explain why they went through some of the suffering that they did, trying to redefine boundaries so that they can stay in the land, and most importantly, show that they are going to be true to the laws that are given in the book of Deuteronomy. Like I said, I'll talk about that a little bit more next week. So this obviously requires some interpretive nuance that's needed. Um, and I know that's difficult for people because a lot of times they just want to sit and read the text from the beginning to the end and say, that's the way it was. That's the way I thought history was when I was going through grade school and junior high and high school. Oh, that's the way it really was until you come back later and say, oh, that's a particular viewpoint of a particular author framing the people and the dates and the events in a particular way. And sometimes, if you're not exposed to other uh, perspectives, you think that's the only way it was until you begin to say, but it doesn't add up. Um, and that's what happens in the book of Joshua and Judges. So scholars think that Joshua was formed uh, to um, to help establish the monarchy, to kind of help the Josiah reforms, and to help the exilic and post-exilic communities gain national unity, religious purity, some type of centralized power and organization. And the way they do it is through this language. God gave us this land. We are chosen. All other people are enemies of God. So what we find here is conquest narrative is often used in various ways for various purposes. Okay, so I promised I would get to Joshua 1 and Judges 1. So if you have a Bible, I want you to look at Joshua chapter 1 for a second. In Joshua chapter 1, you'll be very familiar with some of the verses that are used there that is calling the people to take up arms and go into the promised land. So, beginning in verse 1, it says, Joshua chapter 1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give them to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. Now, incidentally, these are all territories that current Israel is still trying to fight for, and through their own conquest narrative, uh, re, uh, re recapture Lebanon and other places like that. Um, no one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inheritance the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Now, if you read on down through the rest of chapter 1, I encourage you to take a pencil and circle how many times this phrase occurs. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. That'll tie into this idea of trying to reestablish the book of Deuteronomy. Do not turn to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep the book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Then it comes again, verse 9, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Um, Go through the camp, it says in verse 10. So it's kind of mustering up this courage of this is our land. God gave it to us. And anybody that is occupying it is standing against God. And then the chapter finishes down in verse 18. Be strong and courageous. So this sounds like a battle cry, doesn't it? Go forth, be strong and courageous. God will be with you, and you will conquer. So here, and in chapters 2 through 11 as well, it's pictured as a unified nation being led by Joshua. They are militarily successful wherever they go. God is empowering them, and they're taking control of the land of Canaan rapidly. Now, when you come to the book of Judges, it's a different picture. So go over to Judges chapter 1. It's the next book. So you would think, if this is some type of chronological account, that it would still have a remnant of what Joshua just told us. It says, and it starts the same way, rather than the death of Moses, it's the death of Joshua. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites?" The Lord answered, "Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands." So the tribe of Judah. The men of Judah then said to the Simonites, their fellow Israelites, "Come up with us into the territory allotted to us to fight against the Canaanites. We, in turn, will go with you into yours." So already they're beginning to establish, do you see that? Land has already been sectioned off according to the tribes. Judah has a portion of it. The Simonites have a portion of it. And then it says in verse 4, when Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they struck down 10,000 men at Bezek. It was there that they fought Adonai-Bezek and fought against him, putting to rout the Canaanites and the Perizzites. So everything's good so far, right? Seems like we're just picking up from where Joshua left off. But in the same chapter, when you come down to verse 17, it says, "Then the men of Judah went with the Simonites, their fellow Israelites, and attacked the Canaanites living in Zarephath, and they totally destroyed the city. Therefore it is called Hormah. Judah took Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron, each city in its own territory. And the Lord was with the men of Judah, and they took possession of the highlands, or the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots fitted with iron." So here's the first clue: they didn't drive everybody out. There are groups that are still left there. It says the Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites. Oh my, they're both living in the same city now. There seems to be uh, some type of cooperation there where they're both going to settle there. And when you go, you're going to find in chapter 2 disobedience and defeat. Then you begin this cycle where every time they're defeated, they look for a new leader that is called a judge, not a judge with a robe and a gavel, but a military leader to lead them so that they can conquer their enemies that had just defeated them. And when you begin paging through the book of Judges, one of the things that you're going to find is some of these judges uh, take on superhuman kind of roles, like Gideon and so forth. To a certain extent, Samson. But what you're doing is, as you're looking through Judges, you're seeing here defeat after defeat after defeat after defeat. So Joshua and Judges don't seem to be telling the same story. They're certainly not telling it in the same way. So what's going on here? Well, as in always, when you do research into the Bible, there's different viewpoints. Different scholars have different perspectives. The one that you're most frequently associated with is what's I'll call the Conquest model. That's the traditional reading of Joshua. They went in, they wiped everybody out, they obtained the land. What you find here is, if that is even partially true, it's in the early days of Joshua. It certainly isn't into the book of Judges and all the people that come later. The problem is limited archaeological evidence shows destruction, where there's layers of uh, different types of evidence of bloodshed and battle. A second way of looking at this is called peaceful infiltration. So some scholars are saying these nomadic groups that went into this area and settled in this area did so to get away from Egypt. As they did so, they settled in here. And as they settled in there, and when Israel finally left Egypt and marched toward the promised land,
The picture is probably more accurate in Judges than it is in Joshua, as far as the total settlement of the promised land that you find when you come to the Gospels. Then the third scholarly approach is what is called a peasant revolt or indigenous origins. In other words, in this model, the Israelites were assimilating with the Canaanites. Some of them were marginalized by the Canaanites, and as a result of that, Yahweh worship rather than Baal or Ashtoreth and some of these other gods, Yahweh worship became a part of a liberation movement. And Joshua's conquest narrative is really later in its theological story than earlier. So you can do with that what you want. But, many times people do not tell you there are various ways of looking at the text and some of the things that it is telling us. So it boils down really to this. Is the book of Joshua and Judges, is its primary purpose theological or is it historical? And Kate Common in her small little book is saying it seems as though it has more of a theological purpose than it does a historical purpose, because it doesn't seem as though the history fits real well what has been found through archaeology and sociology and some of these other things. So the author of this book would say that Joshua is functioning theologically. It's presenting kind of an idealized vision that they are unified, they are victorious because of God's faithfulness and covenant promises, and all they need to be is strong and courageous. Now, if it is written much later, and you have a group of people that have been in exile for almost 70 years, and if the book of Joshua is being used to try to reestablish the book of Deuteronomy as its foundation for the people that are going to go back into the land, then you can see why this idealized version is needed so that they will be strong and courageous. You remember when they leave Babylon and they go back to Jerusalem, the temple's been destroyed, the walls around Jerusalem have been destroyed, Nehemiah goes back, Ezra goes back, and these individuals really have to muster up courage in the people to rebuild the city and to rebuild the walls eventually. So the book of Judges seems to be more of a realistic picture of probably how it happened historically. But it is certainly true that in the book of Judges, they do capture territory, but it takes a long time. They have to overcome their own compromises. They have to overcome their own failures and disobedience. They have to overcome a lot of the fragmentation that is in the highland settlements. And there is a need for leadership, and that's why they keep looking to judges to lead them into the next wave of their history. So why does this matter? I think it matters primarily because when people take the book of Joshua and they begin to say, hey, we are the heirs of what God promised to Joshua, and we are to be obedient to God by taking the land that he has given us, or in some cases, taking other people's lands because we're chosen and they're not. It can be very dangerous. And I think we see a lot of that going on right now in the current leadership of the nation of Israel. I'm not talking about the people on the ground. I'm not talking about your average Israelite. I'm talking about a very violent leadership in the current nation of Israel that is not only did they do a genocide on the Palestinians, now they're bombing Lebanon. And now they want to seize the land of Lebanon. And and unfortunately, we're not smart enough to see it, and we keep paying for it
And we got into a war where this type of information could have been of great value to the president and his staff when making a decision on whether they're going to start something. So I'm showing you my hand here. Um, Donald Trump went into this war because Israel wanted him to start this war. And that's for a variety of different reasons. There's no good reason for us being there. And what we find taking place is that the justification of weapons of mass destruction is the same flimsy excuse that George W. Bush used when we got into military wars back then, and none of it was ever found. What we find is that nuclear weapons is now the boogeyman. But what we find is that there's no indication if what was true, if it was true that just 6 months ago, when Donald Trump says we obliterated all the nuclear capability of Iran, well, one is true or one isn't, or a little bit of both, or none of it is accurate. So we are unfortunately gullible because we have no way sometimes of figuring out what is true that's being told to us. But what we can do is use wisdom. And that's where I think these type of studies help us understand how to be wise and not stupid or coerced or manipulated by a few verses that's taken out of historical context and brought into our own. So with that, I will stop for our study tonight, and I'll see if you have any reactions as soon as I stop the recording.